Imagine being 83 years old, sitting down to make a record, and somehow, writing some of the most emotionally raw, melodically sharp music of your entire career. A career that includes being in the greatest rock band of all time. That's exactly what Paul McCartney has done with the Boys of Dungeon Lane, and honestly, it genuinely caught me off guard, so let's get into it. Now, I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from with this one because context matters. Like most of you, I first discovered Paul through the Beatles. That's how pretty much every rock fan's story goes, right? You're a kid, someone puts on Abbey Road or Revolver, and your brain is permanently rewired. But a solo career, I've dipped in and out over the years without ever being a devoted follower. The last McCartney solo album I actually sat down and reviewed on this channel was McCartney 3 back in 2020, and funnily enough, that was only about 3 months into running this channel, so it was one of my earliest reviews. I remember enjoying that record quite a bit. It had a lot of variety. I like how Paul used all these instruments, and he was doing all these different things in different styles, and some of it older stuff, and some of it sounded more modern, and it was very reflective. So it felt like an artist taking stock of himself. What I didn't expect was that 5 years later, he'd double down on introspection and take it somewhere even deeper. So going into the Boys of Dungeon Lane, I wasn't hyped up by years of obsessive fandom. I just came into it fresh, and I think that actually helped me hear it clearly. So what is this album exactly? The title refers to a real road in the Speke area of Liverpool, a lane that ran down the Oglet shore on the River Mersey, where the young Paul McCartney used to walk as a kid to go bird watching. That image alone tells you everything about the headspace this record lives in. The phrase itself comes from a 1993 demo he recorded during the Off the Ground sessions, a lyric from a song called In Liverpool. McCartney has also said the phrase brings to mind a couple of local bullies who once mugged him near his childhood home. So even the title is carrying this tension between innocence and harsh reality, which is pretty much the emotional DNA of the whole album. Visually, the artwork was designed by his nephew Josh, drawing from traditional Liverpool street signs and even incorporating the Speke area postcode, L24. Small touch, but it tells you this project is deeply, specifically personal. The album took about 5 years to put together, running from 2021 all the way through 2025, with sessions split between Los Angeles and McCartney's Hog Hill Mill studio in East Sussex. He plays the vast majority of the instruments across all 14 tracks himself, and it was co-produced by Andrew Watt, who you might know with his recent work with Ozzy Osbourne and Eddie Vedder. Now let's talk about the things that don't quite work, because there are a few, and I want to be honest about them before I get into why I think this album is genuinely great. The biggest issue for me is the production. Andrew Watt is a talented producer, but his style is very polished, very slick, and that works against the Boys of Dungeon Lane in places. One of the things that made McCartney 3 so charming was his raw, organic, lo-fi intimacy. That's largely gone here. Some sections feel artificially smooth, almost mechanical, which clashes with the deeply personal, nostalgic material Paul is working with. The drum mixes in particular sound overly programmed at times, and that sits awkwardly against the warm acoustic instrumentation everywhere else. There's also the vocal processing situation. Now, we know Paul McCartney is 83. His voice is thinner than it used to be, more strained in the upper registers, and that's just reality. The problem is that on several tracks, the heavy use of pitch correction and studio processing is very noticeable, and not in a good way. It takes you out of the moment when you're clearly hearing a treated voice instead of a real one. Now, here's the thing. These are mostly minor complaints in the grand scheme of the record. They don't sink it, but they don't stop it from being a flawless album. Because when the record is good, it's really good. McCartney's gift for melody is honestly one of the most unfair things in the history of music, and at 83, it's still very much intact. These aren't just tired, going through the motion melodies. They're tracks built with genuine purpose and master-level finesse. He constructs rich soundscapes, layering worn tape hiss, scuffled acoustic guitars, and little pieces of audio history, train whistles, playground sounds, fairground echoes, ticking clocks. Sounds like a memory itself, which is completely intentional. The album also has an impressive musical range. You get Wings-style guitar rock, classic Beatles harmonies, stripped-back groove-based songs, a big cinematic orchestral moments, all tied together by this consistent autobiographical thread. It never feels scattered because the emotional core is always there. And then there's the nostalgia, which on weaker albums can tip into sentimentality or self-congratulation. That doesn't happen here. McCartney sits still with his own history, the working class Liverpool streets, the early friendships with John Lennon and George Harrison, his parents, and examines all of it honestly rather than just coating it with golden age polish. It feels confessional and it feels real. There's also an argument to be made that his vocal frailty, while a production problem in some spots, actually becomes a strength in others. When he's singing at his most vulnerable, that aging voice carries a kind of grace and weight that a technically perfect vocal performance simply couldn't replicate. So with that being said, let's talk tracks because there are some standout tracks. I know there are 14 songs, so I'm not going to go track by track. I'm just going to pick a few key tracks and I'll say what's important about them. So let's talk about track 2, Lost Horizon. It's basically an ambient audio history project. It layers real sound effects, train whistles, fairground echoes, playground noise, ticking clocks over a heavily bent electric guitar lick. It's impressionistic and unusual and sets the scene for everything else that follows beautifully. Track 6, Down South, one of my personal favorites. It's acoustic, stripped back, tells the story of a real childhood hitchhiking trip Paul took with a young George Harrison, the two future icons, riding in bus and truck cabs, taking about guitars before we learn to twist and shout. They mention that. There's a Glass Onion style, oh yeah, vocal, ad-lib in there. And it's just very nostalgic. So it's warm and simple and lovely. Then there's track 9, Never Know. It's where Paul lets his experimental psychedelic side run loose. It's densely layered, mildly mind-bending, featuring a mellotron. And there's echoes of Strawberry Fields Forever. There's acoustic recorded passages. And that reminded me of The Fool on the Hill and a blazing electric guitar finish, the most sonically adventurous thing on the record. Then there's track 10, probably one that all of you know about, Home to Us. Now, this is probably like the centerpiece of the album. One of the most moving things Paul McCartney has ever recorded in decades, his first ever formal post-Beatles duet between Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. Two old friends, two of the last surviving Beatles, trading vocals and memories about growing up in a bombed-out post-war Liverpool, backed by lush harmonies from Chrissie Hynde and Charlene Spiteri. Carries this incredible, lingering sense of working-class pride and defiance that genuinely got me. And then the album closes with what I think is the best 1-2 punch in years. Track 13, Salesman Saint, a massive cinematic tribute to his parents, Jim and Mary McCartney, and the whole generation that survived World War II and rebuilt Liverpool from the rubble. Sweeping orchestral strings and big brass textures from Giles Martin, with playful 1940s swing-era nods to his father's old jazz band. It's enormous. And then track 14, Mama Gets By, brings it all home. A classic string-laden McCartney piano ballad in the tradition of My Love, written directly for his mother. It is a perfect, quietly devastating conclusion to this album. The aging voice that was sometimes a liability elsewhere is here, and here's the whole point. It's the sound of a man in his 80s singing about his mom, and every crack in that voice earns his place. So, what do I think of The Boys of Dungeon Lane? This is Paul McCartney making the most autobiographical record of his life, and largely pulling it off. The production occasionally works against the material, and the vocal processing can be distracting, but neither issue is fatal. What you're left with is a melodically rich, emotionally honest, beautifully structured album from an artist who clearly still has something real to say. Closing around the tracks, especially in some most emotionally resonant album-ending work McCartney has done in decades. My score will be 8.5 out of 10, a genuinely impressive album, and one I didn't see coming. So check out my review of McCartney 3, which is one of my older videos, but I'll stick it over there. And I'm also going to stick a playlist of 2026 album reviews, so you can check out all the other album reviews I've done so far this year. And thanks for watching. Please like the video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.